Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are staring down a legal paradox that really sits at the heart of American governance.
It's a big one.
It's this tension between two massive concepts, the Federal Tort Claims Act, or FTCA, which generally says, yes, you can sue the government when they hurt you.
Right. The waiver of sovereign immunity.
And then the discretionary function exception, which turns right around and says, actually, no, you can't, if we were making a policy choice. The case we're unpacking today is Whisnant v. United States. It's a case about, well, toxic mold, a naval base, and the very fine line between a protected political decision and just plain old negligence.
It is a fascinating case because it forces us to ask a really difficult question. When does a government decision about safety stop being a high-level policy choice that's protected by immunity and start being just bad professional judgment that gets people hurt?
Exactly. So what's our roadmap for this deep dive?
We have a pretty structured path. First, we're going to define the boundaries of the discretionary function exception under the statute itself. Second, we'll dissect the controlling two-part test that the Supreme Court gave us in Gaubert and Berkovitz.
The big ones.
The big ones. Third, we'll apply this crucial distinction between design and implementation. And finally, to make this all practical, we'll synthesize a diagnostic checklist to help you distinguish between protected policy and unprotected negligence.
Let's dive straight into the doctrine then. Before we get to the moldy meat in Whisnant, we need to understand the machinery.
Yeah.
What exactly is the discretionary function exception, or DFE, within the context of the FTCA?
Well, to understand the exception, you really have to start with the rule. The general rule under the FTCA is that the United States waives its sovereign immunity. It agrees to be liable for torts-like negligence in the same way a private person would be.
Okay, that seems straightforward enough.
But, and this is a massive but, the government is liable except when the claim is based on the exercise or the failure to exercise a discretionary function or duty.
Ah, there it is.
And here's the real kicker. This immunity applies whether or not that discretion was abused.
So wait, even if they make a truly terrible decision, if it's considered discretionary, they're just immune.
Precisely. If it falls inside that exception, the court has no jurisdiction. The case is over before it even begins.
That sounds incredibly broad. There has to be a specific test courts use to figure this out. They can't just wave a magic wand and call everything discretion.
You're right, there is a rigorous test. It comes from two key Supreme Court cases, Gaubert and Berkovitz. It's known as the Gaubert-Berkovitz two-part test.
Let's break that down before we apply it. What's prong one?
Prong one asks a simple question. Is the challenge action discretionary? I mean, is it governed by a mandatory statute, a specific policy, or a regulation? If there's a rule that says you must do X and the employee doesn't do X, then there's no choice involved, no discretion.
So immunity fails right there.
Fails right there.
And if there isn't a mandatory rule?
Then you move to prong two, and this is the harder hurdle we have to ask. Is the challenge action the type of thing Congress wanted to protect? Specifically, is the decision susceptible to social, economic, or political policy analysis?
So is it a real policy choice or just doing a job?
That's the heart of it. If the answer is yes, it's a policy choice, the government is immune.
Okay, that's the framework. Now let's see how this actually plays out in the real world with Whisnant v. United States. Let's analyze Whisnant. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
The facts are pretty visceral. The plaintiff, Lorne Whisnant, worked for a fish supplier. His job was to deliver seafood to the commissary at the Bangor submarine base in Washington.
Okay.
For 3 years, he was in and out of that meat department. And unknown to him at first, toxic, carcinogenic mold was just colonizing the place.
That's horrifying. Did the government have any idea this was happening?
They did. The commissary was operated by a government agency, DACA. They had a contractor, Johnson Controls, doing maintenance, and Johnson Controls submitted safety reports showing the mold problem as early as 1997.
So they knew.
They knew, but they failed to fix it. Whisnant eventually contracted pneumonia, severe headaches, swollen glands, vision problems. It was only after tests confirmed the mold was toxic that the government finally closed the meat market.
And what was the core legal issue when Whisnant sued?
The issue is pretty stark. Was the government's failure to maintain safe premises to clean up the mold barred by the discretionary function exception? The government argued that deciding how to handle maintenance and contractors was a policy choice.
And Whisnant argued it was just plain negligence.
Exactly. The court had to draw a line between the decision to hire a contractor, which might be policy, versus the failure to ensure basic safety, which feels more like simple implementation.
And the lower court, the district court, they actually dismissed his case, didn't they? They bought the government's argument.
They did initially.
So when it got to the Ninth Circuit, what rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable elements.
The Ninth Circuit went right back to basics. They applied that same Galbraith-Berkovitz two-part test. And it has two distinct elements you have to check off.
Yeah.
Element 1. Does a mandatory statute, policy, or regulation prescribe a specific course of action? If it does, the inquiry stops. The exception doesn't apply.
And element 2.
Element 2. If the act is discretionary, is the judgment susceptible to social, economic, or political policy analysis?
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this step by step. How did the court apply the first element, that mandatory regulation inquiry?
Right, so this is our mini IROX for element 1. The sub-issue was whether the regulations for the Defense Commissary Agency, DECA, mandated a specific way to inspect for mold.
A specific checklist, maybe?
Exactly, and in the application, the court looked at the facts and found that while DECA regulations required safety inspections in general, they left the how and when up to the employees. They didn't say, you must swab for this type of mold every Tuesday.
So they had a choice.
They had a choice. So the conclusion for this element was that the conduct was discretionary. Element 1 of the test was satisfied.
So the government wins round 1. The regulations were too vague. That moves us to the harder battle. What about the second element, the policy analysis inquiry? This feels like where the lower court went wrong.
Correct. This is the mini IRA for element 2, and it's really the heart of the case. The sub-issue here is the decision to ignore toxic mold susceptible to policy analysis? Does it involve weighing social, economic, or political options?
And what sub-rule did they use to figure that out?
The court relied on a really important distinction, design versus implementation. The general rule is that the design of safety procedures is usually a protected policy choice, but the implementation of those procedures, that's usually just unprotected professional or safety judgment.
How did they apply that distinction to the moldy meat?
Well, in the application, the court just flatly rejected the government's argument. The government tried to claim that budgetary constraints made this a policy decision, essentially saying, we have limited money, so choosing not to clean the mold was a resource allocation choice.
The budget defense.
The budget defense. And the Ninth Circuit slammed the door on it. Citing cases like ARA Leisure and O'Toole, the court said that cleaning up an obvious health hazard is a matter of professional and scientific judgment, not political policy. The negligence wasn't in hiring a contractor, that's policy. The negligence was in ignoring a specific known hazard, that's implementation.
So you can't just shout budget and get immunity for, having a dangerously dirty facility.
That's it, exactly. So the court's conclusion on this element was that the failure to clean the mold was not a policy decision. Element 2 was not met. The exception failed.
And after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
The Ninth Circuit reversed the district court's dismissal. They held that the discretionary function exception did not apply. The government does not have the discretion to just abdicate its responsibility to maintain safe premises once it chooses to operate them. Whisnant was allowed to proceed with his lawsuit.
This design versus implementation distinction it's still a bit tricky. It feels a little slippery. I want to try and solidify it with a visceral hypothetical to make sure it sticks.
Let's do it.
Okay, picture a lighthouse. A government agency decides to build a lighthouse on a treacherous, rocky coastline. They have a big debate in D.C. about the budget, the location, the political optics. They finally decide to build it. But then, 6 months later, the lighthouse keeper gets lazy. He decides he doesn't feel like walking up all those stairs, so he stops cleaning the lens. The light goes out. A ship crashes.
This is a classic example, actually. It's based on a Supreme Court case called Indian Towing Co., which the Whisnant court relied on. Let's apply the logic. First, look at the decision to build the lighthouse. That is purely design and policy. Whether to have a light, where to put it, how much to spend, that's all protected. If the government had decided not to build the lighthouse to save money, and a ship crashed, no one could sue. That's a political choice.
But the dirty lens.
That's implementation. Once the government exercises its discretion to operate that light, it creates a relationship with the ships at sea. It's now obligated to use due care to keep it working. Allowing the light to go out because you didn't clean the lens isn't a social, economic, or political policy choice. It's just negligence.
So deciding to have a safety program is policy. Actually doing the safety work is implementation.
Precisely. You don't hold a town hall to decide if you should wipe a smudge off a lens. You just do it. That's professional execution, not policymaking.
The Whisnant court cited a couple of other cases to back this up. You mentioned ARA Leisure and O'Toole. Can you briefly clarify how those fit into this puzzle?
Certainly. They help draw the line really clearly. Take ARA Leisure. In that case, the Park Service designed a road through a national park without guardrails. The court said, that's design. They balanced aesthetics, cost, terrain. That's a policy choice, protected. But in the same case, they failed to maintain the road surface, letting it erode. The court said that's implementation. Maintenance is a basic safety responsibility, not a policy debate, unprotected.
And O'Toole, what was that about?
O'Toole involved an irrigation ditch that the government let fall into disrepair, and it ended up damaging a neighbor's property. And guess what defense the government tried?
Let me guess. Budgetary constraints.
You got it. They said, we didn't fix the ditch because we prioritized other spending. The court in O'Toole was very firm. They ruled that budgetary constraints underlie all government activity. If just having a budget was enough to trigger immunity, the exception would swallow the entire rule.
Right, because everything has a budget.
Everything has a budget. That doesn't give you a free pass to be negligent in maintaining your property.
That budget trap is a really important point. It sounds like the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. But it seems the courts just aren't buying it for routine maintenance.
They absolutely are not. If the government operates a grocery store or a lighthouse or an irrigation ditch, they have to act like a responsible owner. They can't just hide behind the entire federal budget to excuse a slip and fall or, in this case, toxic mold.
Okay, we've covered the statute, the test, the case, the hypos. Now, I want to synthesize all of this for the listener who might be looking at a similar fact pattern, maybe on an exam or in practice, and needs a clear way to cut through the noise.
Let's build a diagnostic checklist. If you are facing an FTCA issue with the discretionary function exception, just follow these 4 steps.
Step 1.
Step 1. Identify the conduct. Be very, very specific. What exact act or omission caused the harm? In Whisnant, the court made that huge distinction between the decision to hire a contractor, which might be protected, versus the negligence in ignoring the mold reports. If you identify the wrong conduct, you'll get the wrong answer.
Step 2.
Step 2. The mandatory check. Prong 1. Look for the red tape. Is there a statute, a regulation, a policy that says exactly what the employee must do? If the answer is yes, stop. You're done. There's no discretion, so the exception does not apply. It just becomes a standard negligence inquiry.
And if the answer is no?
If the answer is NO, meaning the employee had a choice, you proceed to step 3.
Which is the big one.
Step 3. The policy filter, prong 2. You have to ask, is this decision susceptible to social, economic, or political policy analysis? And this is where you use that design implementation shortcut.
How does that shortcut work in practice?
Just ask yourself, is it design? Are they writing a regulation, planning a road, setting a budget? If so, it's likely protected. Or is it implementation? Are they sweeping a floor, cleaning mold, maintaining a light, or executing a safety check? If so, it's likely unprotected. And remember the big warning, do not accept we didn't have the money as an automatic policy defense for maintenance failures. Avoid the budget trap.
And finally, step 4.
Step 4, conclusion. You just put it all together. If the conduct boils down to professional or scientific judgment about safety execution rather than some broad political balancing act, the government is liable.
That is a really powerful framework. It takes a lot of the mystery out of the word discretion.
It does. It reminds us that while the government needs room to govern, it doesn't get a free pass to be careless with the day-to-day safety of its citizens.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave the listener with a final provocative thought. We've established that policy protects the government, and maintenance exposes them to lawsuits. But where exactly is that line in the gray areas? I mean, if the government can be sued for moldy meat because they ignored a report, what if they decided at a high policy level to cut the entire cleaning staff budget by 90%?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
At what point does a budget cut, which feels like policy, functionally become negligent maintenance, which is not?
Right. Whisnant tells us you can't use the budget as a shield for specific known failures. But if the policy decision itself makes safety literally impossible, That's a legal battleground that is still being fought over today. It forces us to ask how much immunity we're really willing to grant the state in exchange for the power to govern.
Something to mull over next time you walk into a government building. Thanks for listening to this deep dive into Whisnant.
Stay curious and keep questioning the rules.